Tonight, we begin with a diplomatic explosion that senior NATO intelligence officials have called the most destructive alliance rupture in the post-war era, possibly the most devastating act of retribution against allied nations we've seen since the founding of the Western Security Order. The President of the United States just declared war on America's own allies. 7 nations that shared intelligence, military bases, and security commitments with Washington were publicly named as betrayers of American interests. Retaliatory economic and diplomatic measures were activated within hours, without consultation, without warning, without precedent. And the alliance architecture that kept the Western world united for 80 years just suffered damage that NATO commanders say may prove irreversible. What Donald Trump did this week crossed a line that every previous administration had treated as the foundation of American global power. And when that line shattered, the 7 named allies did not respond with diplomatic protests. They did not request emergency consultations through established channels. They began coordinating a joint response so aggressive, so unified, that White House officials privately admit they never anticipated the possibility that punished allies would band together rather than submit individually. Imagine this scene. In the White House press briefing room, Donald Trump stands at the podium gripping both sides of the lectern, jaw set, staring directly into the camera with an expression reporters who have covered him for years describe as unlike anything they've witnessed. Behind him, a screen displays 7 national flags, each crossed out with a red diagonal line. The imagery is unmistakable. The message is deliberate. The room includes Peter Navarro, senior trade advisor, standing stage left with a thick folder of economic retaliation orders awaiting signature Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, visibly tense and avoiding eye contact with the diplomatic press corps he will need to face afterward, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, whose department must now implement military repositioning across 7 allied nations simultaneously. These are the people who manage America's global alliance network, who maintain the relationships that project American power across every continent, who have spent decades building the trust Trump is about to incinerate publicly. Trump is reading a prepared statement designed to name each allied nation accused of betrayal, to announce specific retaliatory measures against each one, and to establish that American alliance commitments are now conditional on absolute compliance with presidential demands. His advisors watch from the front row. They maintain composed expressions for the cameras, and then one by one they watch as ambassadors from the 7 named nations begin leaving the briefing room before Trump finishes speaking, a coordinated diplomatic walkout that hasn't occurred on American soil since the United Nations debates preceding the Iraq War. Not quiet departures through back doors, not discreet exits after the speech concluded. Visible, deliberate, televised walkouts designed to humiliate the president on his own stage, and Trump, watching the empty chairs multiply in real time on live television, understands that the allies he expected to punish into submission just demonstrated they would rather abandon the room than accept public degradation. Think about that. For weeks now, there had been diplomatic indicators, not from official White House communications, not from formal State Department channels, just quiet signals from National Security Council staffers and allied diplomatic contacts, that Trump was preparing something unprecedented against allied nations. Trump has been confrontational with allies, yes, but he has been escalatory in his confrontation. His demands have followed a certain progression, an intensification, almost a staircase where each step tested whether allies would comply before the next demand arrived. But what set off alarm bells across 7 allied capitals this month was that the staircase suddenly became a cliff. Diplomatic analysts who monitor alliance dynamics know the indicators. The quiet recall of American defense attachés from specific allied capitals for unscheduled consultations, the unusual expansion of Treasury Department sanctions teams assigned to allied nation economic files, the cancellation of 4 scheduled bilateral defense coordination meetings without explanation, the sudden circulation of classified White House memoranda referencing alliance accountability frameworks, terminology with no precedent in American diplomatic vocabulary, all of that converged in the days before the press conference, And whenever an administration simultaneously withdraws diplomatic personnel while expanding sanctions capacity against allies, it means the decision to punish has already been made and the public announcement is merely theater. The alliance framework that maintained Western unity for 8 decades because mutual defense created shared security, because intelligence sharing produced collective strength, and because no single leader had ever weaponized alliance commitments for personal political leverage, has just been deliberately attacked by the leader it was designed to empower. Allied nations failed to meet defense spending targets Trump demanded. Several pursued diplomatic relationships with China that Washington opposed, and specific intelligence sharing decisions by allied services were characterized by the White House as deliberate sabotage. When allied nations conclude that compliance with American demands means surrendering sovereignty while resistance risks economic punishment, that's when alliance systems fracture. That's when the leader of the free world discovers his allies have a breaking point. Let me be very specific about what Trump announced and why NATO officials immediately recognized this as an existential alliance crisis based on the retaliatory measures scope and legal authorities invoked. Trump publicly named 7 allied nations, Germany, France, Canada, South Korea, Japan, Italy, and Turkey, accusing each of specific acts of betrayal involving unauthorized diplomatic engagement with China, insufficient defense spending commitments, intelligence sharing failures, and trade practices characterized as economic warfare against American workers, designed to justify immediate retaliatory action, to establish conditional alliance commitments as official policy, and to demonstrate that no allied nation is immune from American economic punishment. The retaliatory package included emergency tariffs against all 7 nations ranging from 25 to 50% across manufacturing, agriculture, and technology sectors, suspension of intelligence sharing arrangements with 3 of the 7 nations pending compliance reviews that have no established timeline or criteria, formal notification of intent to reduce American military presence in Germany and Japan within 90 days, withdrawal from 2 multilateral trade frameworks specifically designed to maintain allied economic coordination. Marco Rubio, who normally demonstrates careful diplomatic language even under political pressure, stated directly to reporters afterward that the retaliatory measures exceeded anything the State Department had recommended, that the scope was determined by the president personally without interagency review. That intelligence sharing suspension with 3 nuclear allied nations creates immediate security vulnerabilities, and that military repositioning from Germany and Japan simultaneously would require capabilities the Pentagon has not planned for. When allied ambassadors protested that the accusations mischaracterized routine diplomatic activities and that punishing defense spending shortfalls with tariffs violates the NATO treaty framework, Trump dismissed their objections as proof of guilty conscience and suggested that nations unwilling to accept accountability should question whether American protection remains guaranteed. These countries took advantage of America for decades. They smiled at us while stabbing us in the back. That's over. Every single one of them will either pay what they owe or lose what they have. Allied diplomatic responses became progressively more alarming as the day continued. Germany's ambassador called the measures a greater threat to NATO than any action by Russia since the Cold War. France invoked emergency EU consultation procedures designed for external security threats, applying them for the first time to American actions. Japan's foreign ministry issued a statement describing the military withdrawal notification as a fundamental breach of the Mutual Security Treaty. Canada announced immediate retaliatory tariffs targeting American agricultural exports in swing states. Reuters confirmed these developments through sources at multiple allied embassies and within the State Department's European and Asian affairs bureaus. Within 6 hours, emergency assessments were being distributed to NATO headquarters in Brussels, to EU emergency coordination offices, and to the UN Security Council. The consensus was stark and unanimous. The United States has weaponized its alliance commitments against the allies themselves, creating the most significant rupture in Western security architecture since NATO's founding. One senior NATO official speaking on background characterized it as The moment America stopped being the leader of the free world and became its most dangerous disruptor, because the retaliatory measures threaten Allied security more directly than any adversary action in decades. Think about that. The President of the United States just imposed economic warfare on the nations that host American military bases, share nuclear defense arrangements, and have fought alongside American forces in every major conflict since World War II. Trump didn't just punish 7 allies. He demonstrated that American alliance commitments are now transactional instruments that can be weaponized against partners who displease the president personally. For decades, alliance stability was maintained because mutual defense commitments were unconditional, because intelligence sharing operated on institutional trust rather than political approval, and because no president treated allies as subjects who owed personal loyalty. That framework has just been publicly demolished. Allied leaders have concluded that American commitments are now conditional on political compliance, that intelligence sharing can be suspended as punishment, that military presence is a bargaining chip rather than a strategic commitment, and that economic warfare against allies is now an acceptable presidential tool. And most devastatingly, they've recognized that if 7 allies can be punished simultaneously, no allied nation is safe from retribution regardless of its compliance record. When allied nations conclude that loyalty provides no protection while collective resistance might preserve sovereignty, that's when individual submission transforms into unified opposition. That's when alliances don't bend, they break. The response issued by the 7 named allies tonight was not a collection of individual diplomatic protests. It was not a series of bilateral objections through normal channels. It was not measured diplomatic language designed to preserve future negotiation space. It was a joint statement, the first ever issued by allied nations specifically opposing American presidential action. Senior diplomats, after emergency multilateral coordination, described Trump's measures as strategically reckless, legally unprecedented under existing treaty frameworks, and perhaps most significantly, more damaging to Western security than any action by Russia or China in the past decade. But punishment only works if the targets respond individually rather than collectively. The 7 nations did not divide. In fact, their coordinated response this week was among the most unified allied actions we've seen since the formation of NATO itself. Here's what we know. Within 12 hours of Trump's announcement, the 7 nations activated a coordinated counterattack. Joint retaliatory tariffs targeting American exports, specifically in states critical to Trump's electoral coalition. A unified statement from all 7 defense ministers questioning the reliability of American security commitments. Emergency activation of EU and Asian multilateral trade frameworks designed to reduce dependency on American markets. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were strategic countermeasures, economic and diplomatic tools that allied nations only deploy when they have concluded that confrontation is less dangerous than submission. Allied sources confirmed that the 7 nations established a permanent coordination mechanism for sustained collective response, including joint diplomatic approaches to China and Russia, offering expanded engagement specifically excluded by Trump's demands. The allies moved before Washington could isolate them individually. They unified their economic response first. They coordinated their security messaging second. They opened alternative diplomatic channels third. In other words, they targeted Trump's assumption that punished allies would compete to comply rather than cooperate to resist. The leverage that made individual submission rational. This is what made NATO's emergency assessment so alarming. Trump's retaliation wasn't just economically aggressive, it was strategically catastrophic, pushing 7 allies into precisely the unified resistance posture that maximizes their collective leverage against American pressure. It represented the kind of overreach that could permanently restructure global alliance architecture if the administration doesn't reverse course. And the 7 allies, understanding that fully, responded with maximum collective force, not emotionally, not reactively, but with coordinated strategic precision. They didn't fragment under pressure. They didn't compete to appease. They unified immediately. They made collective resistance the rational choice for every threatened ally worldwide. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Alliance strategists now believe that Trump's simultaneous punishment of 7 allies was designed to test whether collective Allied resistance was still possible after years of bilateral pressure had weakened multilateral coordination. Trump wanted to see whether allies would submit individually to avoid being singled out, whether internal political divisions within allied nations would prevent unified response, whether the fear of losing American military protection would override sovereignty concerns. But instead, the opposite happened. The allies didn't fracture under simultaneous pressure. They consolidated a collective response so rapid, so comprehensive, that even White House strategists were forced to recalculate their fundamental assumptions about Allied willingness to resist American coercion. You don't get 7 sovereign nations to issue a joint opposition statement within 12 hours without proposing something that threatens all of them equally. But this week, Trump achieved exactly that unintended outcome. The psychological impact on Trump personally represents a fundamental challenge to his dealmaker identity. Trump built his political brand around being the negotiator who divides opponents, the leader who isolates targets for individual pressure, and the president whose bilateral leverage overwhelms any single nation's resistance. His entire alliance strategy depends on appearing so powerful that resistance is irrational. This week's unified Allied response directly destroys that appearance. Trump cannot back down because that would validate collective resistance as effective strategy against American pressure. But Trump also cannot escalate because every additional measure strengthens the case for permanent Allied coordination against American coercion. He is trapped between retreating from his most public retaliatory action and doubling down into a confrontation where 7 allies acting collectively hold more economic leverage than the United States acting alone. That strategic bind, combined with mounting domestic economic pressure from retaliatory tariffs and growing bipartisan congressional concern about alliance destruction, creates conditions where the administration's foreign policy might become increasingly erratic. Alliance strategists speaking with the Financial Times under strict anonymity described Trump's position as strategically self-defeating, a signal that the retaliation's architect has become its most prominent victim. But the 7 allied nations proved this week that Western alliance coordination remains functional, just not in the direction Washington intended. Their joint response was not only unified, it was sequenced so precisely that each announcement reinforced the previous one's impact before Washington could formulate counter-narratives. That sequencing matters because it reveals alliance coordination capability that Trump's strategy assumed no longer existed. It shows that allied nations are not passive recipients of American demands. They are strategic actors capable of turning American pressure into American isolation. Trump's simultaneous retaliation creates cascading effects that undermine American strategic architecture across multiple dimensions. First, it establishes that American alliance commitments are conditional on presidential approval, destroying the unconditional mutual defense guarantee that NATO's deterrent credibility depends upon. Second, it signals to Russia and China that Western alliance unity can be fractured by the alliance leader himself, the most valuable intelligence gift any adversary could receive. Third, it creates conditions where allied nations actively pursue alternative security arrangements, potentially including European defense autonomy and Asian multilateral frameworks that permanently reduce American strategic influence. Fourth, it sends unmistakable signals to every non-allied nation that American partnership carries unpredictable political risk, accelerating global diplomatic diversification away from Washington. And fifth, it inevitably strengthens the exact adversarial relationships Trump claims to oppose, as punished allies explore expanded engagement with China and Russia specifically to reduce vulnerability to American coercion. Now, we need to talk about historical parallels, because understanding how alliance fractures have unfolded before illuminates why diplomatic historians see this moment as potentially irreversible. The most relevant parallel is the 1956 Suez Crisis, when the United States turned against its closest allies, Britain and France, over their independent military action in Egypt. Washington imposed devastating economic pressure against allied nations pursuing policies that conflicted with American strategic preferences. Those allies experienced currency crises, diplomatic humiliation, and permanent reduction in global influence. Those nations eventually submitted to American pressure because their economic dependency provided no alternative, because the Soviet threat required American protection, and because no multilateral resistance mechanism existed. That process didn't happen through sudden collapse, but through accumulated humiliations where each allied concession established precedents for future subordination. The result was decades of allied deference to American leadership that many historians argue was purchased through coercion rather than earned through partnership. Another parallel is France's 1966 withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command when de Gaulle concluded that American alliance leadership served American interests at the expense of French sovereignty. De Gaulle ordered American military bases closed on French soil. Many allies privately sympathized while publicly maintaining solidarity with Washington. The result wasn't alliance collapse, but permanent structural damage that took decades to partially repair and fundamentally altered how European nations calculate their dependence on American protection. The current situation approaches a similar inflection point where American coercion against 7 allies simultaneously may produce not individual submission, but permanent structural realignment. The visible alliance restructuring hasn't fully occurred, but the conditions that precede fundamental realignment are manifestly present and accelerating with every retaliatory round. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Trump's retaliation happened at a time when the Western alliance is already under extraordinary pressure from multiple adversaries. Defense hawks want maintained alliance cohesion to counter Russian aggression. Trade advisors want economic leverage against allied competitors. Intelligence agencies want preserved sharing arrangements essential for counterterrorism. And American military commanders want the overseas bases that host American strategic power projection. Trump is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing confrontations with China, Iran, and North Korea that all require allied cooperation. And when presidents in that position attack their own allies, they're not acting from strategic confidence. They're acting from political calculation. They're acting from the assumption that domestic audiences value punishment over partnership. The strategic implications for American global positioning are profound and create both opportunities and risks that the National Security Council is carefully monitoring. The opportunity is that allied compliance might actually increase if the demonstrated consequences of resistance prove sufficiently costly. The administration has already demonstrated willingness to impose devastating economic punishment, to suspend intelligence sharing with nuclear allies, to threaten military withdrawal from strategic positions. If allied resistance fractures, as some White House models project, if individual nations break from collective solidarity to negotiate bilateral accommodations, if domestic politics within allied nations produce leadership more amenable to American demands, Trump might achieve compliance levels unprecedented in alliance history. The risk is equally significant. Allied collective resistance may prove more durable than American pressure, producing permanent alliance restructuring that reduces American global influence. Intelligence sharing suspension may create security vulnerabilities that adversaries exploit before arrangements can be restored. Military repositioning threats may call American bluffs that undermine deterrence credibility permanently. The National Security Council is calibrating escalation to maximize allied compliance while remaining prepared for scenarios ranging from individual allied submission to sustained collective resistance to permanent Western alliance dissolution. Think about what this means for American global security, and understand why strategists who monitor alliance dynamics believe this week might represent the most consequential decision any American president has made about the Western alliance since its creation. The question facing Washington is not whether Trump's retaliation damaged alliances, which seems undeniable from every diplomatic assessment this week, but whether the damage serves American interests or permanently diminishes American global power. Analysts who characterize this as an alliance extinction event understand that demonstrated consequences create short-term leverage, but also that permanent allied realignment creates long-term strategic isolation. The opportunity is clear: force allied compliance through overwhelming pressure before collective resistance solidifies into permanent alternative structures. The danger is equally clear. Every day of sustained collective resistance demonstrates that American coercion can be defeated, encouraging broader allied independence. White House strategists are intensifying planning for scenarios ranging from allied capitulation to sustained resistance to permanent Western security architecture fracture. Remember, Trump thought punishing 7 allies simultaneously would demonstrate strength. He thought individual fear would prevent collective response. He thought allies had no alternative to American partnership. But tonight, 7 nations responded as one. Collective resistance proved faster and more unified than anyone in Washington anticipated, and the assumption that allies had no alternative just accelerated their search for exactly that. Now, let me bring this full circle to where we started tonight. Yes, to that moment in the White House briefing room when 7 ambassadors stood and walked out while the president was still speaking. What that moment represents is not just diplomatic protest, but the visible fracture of an alliance system that maintained global stability for 80 years. The moment when the assumption that American leadership meant American authority collided with the reality that allies who feel betrayed by their protector will seek protection elsewhere. Think about what it means that 7 allied nations coordinated a joint response within 12 hours. Think about what it means that punished allies immediately opened diplomatic channels with the adversaries Trump claims to oppose. Think about what it means that the most powerful alliance in human history is fracturing not from external attack, but from internal aggression by its own leader. That's not a policy dispute. That's an alliance crisis where the leader's actions are more destructive than the adversaries, and where the trajectory points inevitably toward permanent structural realignment. And here's the profound truth about alliances. They often appear indestructible, but depend on mutual trust that collapses invisibly when one partner begins treating the others as subordinates rather than equals. NATO seemed unbreakable until political pressure exposed how fragile institutional trust had become. The British Empire's alliance network appeared permanent until colonial subjects concluded that partnership meant submission. These fractures surprised observers because the erosion of mutual respect remained invisible until one overreach revealed it. The Western alliance is experiencing that same overreach. Now we're watching the response unfold in real time. This is where moral clarity meets strategic reality. The administration chose to weaponize alliances that previous presidents treated as the foundation of American power. This crisis is Washington's creation, not the Allies' invention. And that choice creates a narrowing window for reversing course before the most valuable strategic asset America has ever possessed fractures beyond repair. Tonight, one thing is clear. 7 allied nations have demonstrated that collective resistance to American coercion is both possible and effective. The unconditional alliance commitments that maintained Western security for 80 years are now explicitly conditional, and the retaliation designed to punish allies into submission has instead unified them into the most coordinated opposition an American president has ever faced from partners. And tonight, for the first time in the post-war era, America's allies appear to be more unified against Washington than against any external adversary. NATO headquarters is quiet, too quiet. And when the most successful military alliance in human history goes quiet after its leader attacks its members, it means the structures that maintained Western unity are being fundamentally reconsidered. Because tonight, the Western alliance learned 3 things it cannot unlearn: that American protection now comes with conditions no previous president imposed, that collective allied resistance is more effective than individual compliance, and that the leader who built the free world security architecture just demonstrated he is willing to destroy it. This story is far from over. We will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.